March 15, 1944, 25,000 feet above Berlin. The Messerschmitt pilot from Bavaria was laughing. Through the curved glass of his canopy, he watched the American fighter struggle to line up behind him. The silver P-51 Mustang wobbled slightly in the thin air, its nose drifting wide of the proper lead angle. Amateur work. The German ace had 17 victories painted beneath his cockpit. He had been fighting since France, survived Britain, and sharpened his skills against the Soviets. He knew bad shooting when he saw it. "These Americans," he muttered, easing his Bf-109 into a smooth climbing turn. All engine, no finesse. He rolled inverted, deliberately slow, letting the Mustang see the black crosses on his wings and the kill marks beneath his cockpit rail. A taunt. A lesson. At this altitude, with both aircraft pulling hard GS, deflection shooting was an art that took years to master. The American would miss. They always did. Behind him, Lieutenant James Howard of St. Louis flipped a small switch on his instrument panel. A gyroscope spun up behind the glass of his gunsight. The reticle changed. The German pilot never saw it happen. Howard wasn't calculating angles. He wasn't estimating range or lead. He wasn't doing what fighter pilots had done since 1916, guessing where an enemy would be when bullets arrived. The glowing amber pipper in his sight floated away from the nose of his aircraft, sliding smoothly through empty sky, tracking the Messerschmitt's future position. Howard framed the German fighter between the moving diamonds, twisted the grip to match its wingspan, and squeezed the trigger. 6.50 caliber machine guns fired as one. The bullets didn't chase the Messerschmitt. They met it. The first rounds tore through the tail. The next walked forward with mechanical precision, ripping into the fuselage and cockpit in a perfectly spaced line. The German pilot had just enough time to feel confusion, pure, disbelief-filled confusion, before his canopy shattered and the aircraft came apart around him. He never transmitted a warning. Within 6 minutes, Howard shot down 4 more German fighters and damaged 3 others. Across the sky, Luftwaffe pilots were dying in ways that made no sense. Americans who couldn't hit anything yesterday were suddenly making impossible shots. High deflection angles, brutal turning fights, bullets arriving exactly where no human mind could predict. Something had changed. The technology that did it hadn't been designed for fighter pilots at all. 2 years earlier, in a British laboratory, scientists were trying to solve a different problem. German dive bombers were tearing into Royal Navy ships, and naval gunners couldn't hit them reliably. Physicists studying gun camera footage reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The human brain was terrible at 3-dimensional prediction. A moving gun platform firing at a moving target, accounting for gravity, wind, speed, and angle, succeeded less than 2% of the time. But a gyroscope didn't get confused. Connected to a simple analog computer, it could calculate where a target would be and place the aiming point there instantly. The British shared the concept with the Americans in late 1943. The Navy took interest. The Army Air Forces nearly ignored it. Fighter pilots were cowboys. They trusted instinct, eyesight, and experience. They didn't want a machine telling them how to shoot. The device was heavy, delicate, and required modifications to fit into a fighter cockpit. Most reports were filed and forgotten. One man didn't forget. Colonel James Doolittle had been reading lost statistics from bomber escort missions. American fighters could now reach Berlin thanks to drop tanks. But over target, they were being slaughtered by experienced Luftwaffe pilots. The problem wasn't courage or numbers. It was gunnery. Doolittle ordered the new K-14 gyroscopic computing gunsight installed in P-51 Mustangs immediately. The pilots hated it. Captain Robert Johnson from Oklahoma had spent 2 years mastering deflection shooting the hard way. He knew how to feel lead angles, how to judge range by instinct. On his first missions with the K-14 installed, he turned it off out of spite. On his 4th mission, over Stuttgart, he tangled with a Focke-Wulf 190 flown by a veteran German pilot. The fight went in tight circles, both aircraft straining at the edge of blackout. Every time Johnson thought he had a shot, the German rolled away. Johnson was exhausted. Furious, he flipped the K-14 on. The reticle came alive, sliding smoothly ahead of the enemy aircraft. Johnson stopped aiming where the fighter was and put the pipper where the sight told him to. He fired. All 6 guns converged on a single point in space. The FW-190 flew straight into it. The German pilot never understood how the American had made that shot while pulling 4GS. The human brain blurred under G-force. The gyroscope didn't. By February 1944, hundreds of Mustangs carried the K-14. The Germans noticed immediately. Shots that should have missed were hitting. Young American pilots were firing from angles no trained ace would attempt and scoring kills. Luftwaffe veterans began reporting that American accuracy had improved overnight by an impossible margin. On February 20th, a group of seasoned German fighters engaged 8 Mustangs over Augsburg. 4 Germans died in the first pass. Not damaged, destroyed. The survivors came home shaken, convinced they were no longer fighting men, but something else. Something calculating. Something that didn't guess. The age of instinctive air combat was ending, and most of the Luftwaffe didn't yet understand why. By the end of February 1944, the Luftwaffe knew something was terribly wrong. Not rumors. Not pilot exaggeration. Numbers. Fighter Gruppen that had once returned from bomber interceptions with modest losses were now coming back shattered. Veteran pilots, men with 20, 30, even 50 confirmed victories, were being shot down in seconds. Not worn down, not outflown, simply hit. Again and again. Major Wilhelm Goose, a Staffel commander with more than 20 kills, was one of the first to understand that instinct alone could no longer explain what was happening. On February 20th, he led 12 Bf-109s out of Augsburg to intercept a bomber stream headed for aircraft factories along the Danube. Intelligence reported only 8 American fighters in the area. A favorable engagement. It became a disaster. The Mustangs didn't maneuver like rookies. They didn't spray fire wildly. They waited, then fired short, devastating bursts from angles Goose would have sworn were impossible. In the first 30 seconds, 4 German fighters were destroyed outright. Not trailing smoke. Not limping away. Gone. Goose himself was hit by a deflection burst that walked forward along his fuselage, shredding the rudder and elevator. He survived only by snap rolling into a dive, so violent, he blacked out briefly. When he regained control, half his aircraft was missing. Back on the ground, only 3 of his 12 pilots returned. Goose wrote in his after-action report that American pilots appeared to be shooting into the future. He wasn't far off. Across Germany, similar reports piled up. Oberleutnant Friedrich Beck, a veteran of Spain with 96 victories, wrote that American gunnery had become unnatural. Bullets arrived exactly where evasive maneuvers should have worked. Tight turns no longer saved pilots. Barrel rolls no longer shook pursuers. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They ordered more violent maneuvers, snap turns, rolling scissors, high-G brakes designed to overload the attacker. It didn't help. The K-14 gunsight recalculated continuously, unaffected by blackout, fatigue, or panic. Where a human pilot lost precision under stress, the gyroscope remained perfect. They tried randomness, unpredictable jinks, erratic throttle changes, sudden dives. But randomness only confused humans. The computer adjusted its solution dozens of times per second. Some aces discovered the only partial defense: get very close. Knife fight range, where deflection disappeared and combat became pure reflex. But closing that distance meant flying straight into the Mustang's guns, and it abandoned the Germans' traditional advantages in altitude and energy. Meanwhile, American pilots were learning fast. Lieutenant David Williams from Nebraska had been nearly useless in air combat before receiving the K-14. He emptied belts without results, misjudged leads, and survived more on luck than skill. With the computing gunsight installed, his transformation was immediate. Over Augsburg, Williams shot down 2 Messerschmitts and damaged a third. 1 kill made during a high-speed barrel roll at a geometry no human could calculate. He didn't feel clever afterward. He felt stunned. "I just put the pipper where it told me," he wrote later. And squeezed. Williams wasn't unique. Pilots who would have been dead in their first month were suddenly lethal. Training curves collapsed. Experience mattered less. Trust in the machine mattered more. The Germans realized something else, too. Even if they understood what the Americans were using, they couldn't copy it. In June 1944, they nearly captured a K-14 intact when a Mustang went down near Frankfurt. Engineers rushed the wreckage to a secure facility. What they found was deeply discouraging. The concept was simple. The execution was not. The gyroscopes required tolerances German factories could no longer maintain. Special lubricants functioned at extreme cold. Miniaturized analog components held calibration under constant vibration and G-forces. Germany's bomb-damaged industry couldn't replicate it quickly, if at all. And even if they could, there was another problem. Time. By mid-1944, new Luftwaffe pilots were entering combat with less than 50 flight hours. Many had fewer than 30. Teaching them revolutionary new systems was impossible when most didn't survive their first or second mission. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Veterans who had spent years mastering deflection shooting now found themselves outgunned by Americans who had been flying fighters for weeks. Skill had been equalized and then rendered irrelevant. Major Gunther R., one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, later wrote that the appearance of the computing gunsight marked the exact moment he knew the air war was lost. Not because of numbers, not because of fuel shortages, because the Americans had learned how to industrialize accuracy. Captain Bill Anderson from Ohio had resisted the K-14 at first. He considered it cheating. Over Hamburg in July 1944, that belief evaporated. His squadron intercepted a group of FW-190s diving steeply onto B-24s, an attack profile designed to be unhittable. Anderson rolled inverted, dove after one attacker, and watched the Pipper slide ahead of the German fighter with eerie calm. He fired. The FW-190 disintegrated. Anderson shot down 2 more that day. His wingman, still using a conventional sight, fired hundreds of rounds without scoring a hit. After that, no one turned the K-14 off. By late summer 1944, hit probabilities in some American squadrons exceeded 30%. Before the K-14, 2% had been considered good. The kill ratios reversed completely. The Luftwaffe began avoiding P-51s whenever possible, striking bombers only when escorts were absent, and fleeing the moment Mustangs appeared. Even jets couldn't fully escape. In January 1945, a Me-262 pilot attempted to turn with P-51s, confident in his speed advantage. He died when a Mustang pilot fired at empty sky and let the jet fly into the solution already calculated. The realization spread quietly through the German ranks. They were no longer fighting pilots. They were fighting mathematics. And mathematics didn't get tired. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was still flying, but it was no longer fighting. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft that might once have challenged the sky. Training programs collapsed under bombing and desperation, sending boys with barely 30 hours of flight time into combat. Those who survived their first mission rarely survived their second. And waiting for them above the Reich were American fighters whose pilots no longer needed instinct, experience, or genius to win. They only needed to trust the glowing Pipper. The K-14 computing gunsight had quietly ended the era of aerial dueling. The age when victory depended on a pilot's feel for angles, his ability to visualize invisible geometry, his mastery of deflection shooting earned over hundreds of combat hours. That world vanished in a matter of months. German veterans felt it most sharply. Major Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring aces to survive the war, later said that fighting K-14 equipped Mustangs felt like engaging aircraft from the future. Pilots could no longer shake an attacker through skill alone. Every maneuver, barrel roll, snap turn, dive, was instantly countered by a calculation the human brain could never perform in time. What the Germans faced was not superior flying. It was automated prediction. The human cost was staggering. In the final year of the war, more than 13,000 Luftwaffe pilots were killed or captured. Many were teenagers. They faced Americans whose machines made them deadly at any angle, any speed, any altitude. Experience no longer protected you. Talent no longer saved you. The story of the Marseilles family captured the tragedy perfectly. Hans-Joachim Marseille, the legendary Star of Africa, had died in 1942, before the K-14 reached combat. His younger brother flew defense of the Reich in 1945, determined to live up to the legend. He trained obsessively, studying deflection geometry the way his brother once had. In January 1945, he encountered a K-14, equipped P-51 over Hanover. The American pilot was Lieutenant Carl Peterson from Nebraska, a farmer's son with no exceptional gunnery record. In a turning fight, Peterson fired from an angle that would have made Hans Joachim famous, and would have been impossible for a human to compute under G-load. The younger Marseille survived, bailing out with severe burns. After the war, he admitted he was glad his brother never saw what air combat had become. Not art, not mastery, mathematics solved by machines. The technology spread rapidly. The Soviets demanded examples through Lend-Lease and immediately began reverse engineering them. The British refined their own versions. The French rebuilt their air force around computing sites as standard equipment. Within 5 years, every major power fielded fighters whose pilots no longer aimed. They confirmed solutions. The romantic era of fighter aviation was over. Captain David Williams, one of the earliest K-14 users, stayed in the Air Force after the war. In Korea, flying an F-86 Sabre with an improved descendant of the same technology, he shot down 3 MiG-15s flown by highly trained Soviet pilots. Superior aircraft, skilled opponents. Same result. The machines still calculated faster. Some German survivors argued that skill still mattered, and they weren't entirely wrong. But the numbers told the real story. By spring 1945, kill ratios reached 10-1 in favor of the Americans. No amount of instinct could overcome that level of precision. A German ace-turned-aerospace engineer later calculated that the K-14 effectively granted American pilots the equivalent of 2 extra years of combat gunnery experience. It compressed mastery into weeks. That was the real revolution, not just accuracy, but speed of transformation. The last Luftwaffe pilot known to encounter a K-14 in combat was Klaus Müller, flying a battered Bf-109 on May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. Unaware the war had ended, he engaged a flight of Mustangs. One American pilot, Captain Tom Anderson from Wisconsin, had a perfect firing solution. Instead of pulling the trigger, Anderson flew alongside Müller and signaled him to land. Müller complied. On the ground, Anderson showed him the gunsight. Müller stared at it for a long time and said quietly that he never would have fought if he'd known. Not because he lacked courage, but because courage meant nothing anymore. The K-14's legacy reached far beyond World War II. Its analog computing principles fed early missile guidance systems. Its gyroscopes improved submarine navigation. Its philosophy, machine-assisted decision-making, became the foundation of modern air combat. Every pilot who looks through a heads-up display today inherits that moment when German laughter turned to silence over Berlin. Lieutenant James Howard, whose impossible shots stunned the Luftwaffe in March 1944, lived to see fighters that could destroy enemies beyond visual range. Before his death, he reflected that the K-14 wasn't about killing Germans. It was about realizing machines could do what humans never could, and once they could, war would never be the same. Before the K-14, American pilots fired roughly 1,000 rounds per kill. After it, fewer than 250. Hit probability jumped from 2% to over 30%. In 6 months, the air war over Europe was rewritten. The German pilots who laughed in early 1944 hadn't been mocking Americans. They were mocking the future. And the future answered with mathematics, steel, and fire, delivered by farm boys whose machines could think faster than any human ever would. That was the moment the art of air combat ended. And nothing replaced it, except victory.